Time for the bottom line, a wrap of the day's business news. The second Africa Investment Forum has secured $40.1 billion in deals. That's nearly 6 trillion rand. The three-day conference came to a close today. Organisers had set their sights on doubling last year's investment commitments. That didn't happen. Those commitments last year, $38 billion.
This year, $67 billion in conversations around deals. Last year, $48 billion of conversations around deals. And that is what we are doing. You know, the amount of financing gap we have for infrastructure in Africa alone is anything between $68 billion and $108 billion a year.
Yeah.
And so you can either look at that as a problem. I don't. I see that as a massive investment opportunity. And so this forum is basically saying, we're not just going to sit around and be talking deficit, right? We got to talk opportunities. And so how do we package projects? How do we make sure that we get folks to look at Africa as a viable investment destination and help them to change the lenses which they look at Africa? Africa is not looking for aid, you see. Africa is looking for investments. And what this forum will continue to do is to make that case for Africa, not by talking about it, but actually showing that the bankable deals are there, the transactions can be closed, and we are there on this platform helping investments to land in Africa, like let me say, like a South African airline plane landing on a smooth runway.
All right, that was Akinwumi Adesina from the African Development Bank, and that full interview will play an African perspective a little later tonight. Let's stay with this. The African Investment Forum to discuss. We're joined by the Special Advisor to the Gauteng Premier, Mduduzi Mbada. Great to have you with us, Mr. Mbada. Just firstly, was this good for Gauteng to have this investment forum here, following on from our own last week in Sandton?
It's true. Thank you very much, and thank you for having us. This was a very successful second edition of the Africa Investment Forum. It's a platform that we're creating for Africans to come together and talk about transactions, talk about deals, but talk about financing development in the continent, as you heard President Adesina explaining the deficit with regards to infrastructure. The more we invest in infrastructure, the better for us to have efficiency, the ease of doing good, the movement of goods and the movement of people. Secondly, the usefulness of this year's Africa Investment Forum, it happens at the time when the majority of countries in the continent have ratified the Free Continental Trade Agreement. So this gives us an opportunity to increase trade between ourselves as African countries.
Yeah. He did say, though, that he wanted to double last year's $38 billion, only by a touch, so $40 billion. That's nowhere near doubling. Is it still a good figure?
It's a good figure. If you look at it from a perspective that this is the first of its kind in the continent, there's been many gatherings in the continent, but there's never been a gathering where we sit down in a small boardroom like this with investors to ask you, Francis, how much investment do you need? Is your project ready? Is your project ready for bankability? Can we finance it? What are the regulatory issues we need to deal with working with you? So in a way, it's a beautiful environment that I think we must embrace. But more importantly, we must make sure that it grows to greater heights so that we can address the rest of the problems in the continent.
It sounds like the planning is so important. So does the African Development Bank sit there with these investors, find out who's ready, and then try and bring the right investors, whether they're from overseas or from Africa, to this conference?
In fact, we call it speed dating. Because what it means...
You need the money on the table already.
Yes. By the time I sit with you as an investor, through the system that the African Development Bank and its partners, which are a number of multi-development finance institutions in the continent and outside of the continent. So we will put your deal through that process so that by the time we sit here over these 3 days, we would have engaged with your deal and we sit with you in what we call the boardroom sessions. So what you see, the marketplace, people sitting there doing B2B, engaging with each other. Behind that, there's what we call the boardroom sessions, where then investors sit with you as the initiator or the project sponsor to see how best we can come to a conclusion or concluding the deal.
Okay, so 40.1 billion, according to my calculations, nearly 6 trillion rand. How much of that did South Africa get?
South Africa had put about 5 projects into the boardroom session. which were worth about 7.9 billion rands, dollars rather. We ended up attracting about 3.6 billion investment, which necessarily would have wished for more, if not that 7.
So that's about half of what we wanted.
Half of what we wanted.
In the boardroom session.
It could be that our preparation is a big challenge, and we need to invest more on preparation. And we're working very closely with the Development Bank of Southern Africa, because it's not just projects that are coming from Gauteng, it's projects across the continent through the Infrastructure Coordinating Committee, through the Department of Trade and Industry and National Treasury, and working with the DBSA. We're packaging projects, because one of the beautiful things about the Africa Investment Forum is that it doesn't end now. So there's a deal tracker. So things go through that deal tracker. Even now, we can still submit projects that we think are bankable, and working with the African Development Bank and other banks, they become our guarantee. They handhold us to engage investors so that we can get these projects to bankability.
Okay, so $3.6 billion. What sort of projects are these for South Africa? I mean, what does this mean for ordinary South Africans?
It means a lot, because one of the big ones was on housing. Especially social housing, because we need to build houses, but also build new cities. As the president was raising it in one of his State of the Province address, are going to build post-apartheid cities that are socially inclusive, that have socio-economic activities. So that's one of the big projects that we have. One of
and
the
is that a foreign investor, an African investor? Where is the money coming from?
In the room, we will have both investors from the continent and investors outside of the continent. Fortunately, I attended that boardroom session. In that boardroom session, we had investors coming from outside, but also we had other boardroom session which was on waste to energy. A very big part of it was mainly in the Gauteng metropolitan cities, Ekurhuleni and Tshwane. Even there, we had a lot of investors from the Trade Development Bank to the BDR, which is the one of the Arabic Development Banks. So in a way, many of the institutional investors have shown interest beyond our borders and also beyond the continent.
Should we be worried? Because we're getting less than 10% of this pie, if we see this $40 billion as the pie. We wanted much more. There seems to be a lot of excitement around African countries that are growing at rates of 6%, 5%. We're nowhere near there. We've always had this, we think, special position, but are we losing that on the African continent? Are investors looking elsewhere and saying that's more exciting, and South Africa is still not sorting out its problems?
We are not losing that. The fact that we're hosting something of this nature, capital is trusting us. Capital thinks that we can transact in South Africa, but capital believes that them investing or working in South Africa, their capital can be followed up, because that has been part of the problems in the past. But the second important aspect as well is that, remember, we are the gateway to the rest of the continent. We are willing to create this platform with the African Development Bank and other institutional investors, because we think if we can contribute to the development of Africa, we will be solving a number of historic problems in the rest of the continent. Of course, we are not growing at the rate we want to grow, but I think President Ramaphosa and the work that Premier Makura and other premiers are doing in their provinces, we are trying to bring the private sector on board so that we can indeed get our economy to grow at the level we want it to grow.
All right, thank you very much. Wrapping up the African Investment Forum, that was Mduduzi Mbada, Special Advisor to the Gauteng Premier. Okay, now the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa and the SA Cabin Crew Association, we were talking about this earlier, threatening to embark on that mother of all strikes at SAA. In just 2 days, they gave the beleaguered airline a 48-hour notice of a strike today. The union members demanding an 8% wage increase, job security for 3 years as well. This follows the announcement by SAA on Monday that it could cut around 950 jobs to bring costs under control. Well, earlier today, speaking in Parliament, SAA said that the strike action would cripple operations and could cost the cash-strapped airline up to 50 million rand a day. Let's take a look.
SAA board was briefing Parliament's Standing Committee on Public Accounts on its failure to table its financial statements for the past 2 financial years.
We could prepare them on a liquidation basis. To do that, we have to place the company into liquidation. There are some consequences that I have to say are catastrophic in the context of placing SAA into liquidation. In no order of importance, the first is that all of the loan agreements accelerate. It's a default under the loan agreements and under the lease agreements. You'll be well aware of the fact that we have 9.2 billion rands worth of debt that comes due, and we've had to shunt, I would say, from month to month. But our leases on the planes also will be accelerated. So we're not talking about 9 billion rands worth of obligations. We're talking about in excess of 40 billion rands worth of obligations that have to be settled immediately.
Martin, you've painted a very bleak picture, and I have no doubt that it's accurate, but I think there's some options that you haven't considered or haven't mentioned. Why is the board not looking at business rescue?
Kingston said that option was also not feasible and that the board cannot do so without the shareholders' consent.
We can have the accounts signed tomorrow with a disclaimed opinion. And I'm saying if you issue that disclaimed opinion from the auditors just on one matter, no other matter, the fuel suppliers will pool their facilities. It's 581 million that I need to find tomorrow. Tomorrow, no flight will take off. So apologies if it seems that the sentence was disrespectful. However, it's just to indicate the house is on fire.
To compound SAA's problems, the unions have threatened to go on strike.
The unions have gone to the CCMA and they have non-resolution certificates, which mean that they can declare strike in 48 hours. We have received a notification of strike this morning from NUMSA and SACA, 2 unions, and that's the cabin crew. And once there is no cabin crew in an aircraft, the aircraft can't take off. Those are the issues that we just thought let us sensitize you to, so that you are aware of this. You are not surprised when you see things happening at Airways.
Despite this, the Public Accounts Watchdog Body has told board members that they were breaking the law by failing to submit the airline's financial statements. And Scopa had stern warning for the board.
The fundamental issue here is that you need to shape up or ship out.
Scopa has given SAA until the 27th of this month to return to Parliament with a clear plan that indicates when they will submit the company's financial statements. Vuyani Green, SABC News, Parliament.
All right, with that, let's take a look at the numbers. Here are your main financial indicators.